So, is it finally clear now why it's the Russians who are disrupting the negotiations? American intelligence reported to Donald Trump that Vladimir Putin refuses to stop the war and is ready to fight for another 2 years to fully capture Donbas. As sources indicated, even if capturing Donetsk region takes another 2 years of war, Putin is confident that every day of fighting and bombing Ukrainian infrastructure and residential buildings only increases his advantages. Meanwhile, Donald Trump insists that Vladimir Putin wants to end the war, and Zelensky is the one preventing it. American intermediaries Stephen Witkoff and Kushner told Zelensky that Trump proposed Ukraine withdraw its troops from the areas of Donbas it controls and allow that territory to become a demilitarized free economic zone. However, Washington still hasn't decided which country, Ukraine or Russia, will have sovereignty over this territory. Although experts insist that this is only the first step toward de facto recognition of the occupation and Russian control. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment you wish. If you consider our work important and necessary, you can support this YouTube channel financially with your donation or a paid subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. Any support you can give is appreciated. So, sources from the New York Times today report that in Geneva, Donald Trump's administration tried several negotiation tactics at once. In Geneva, President Trump's most trusted envoys, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, entered into negotiations with the Iranians in the morning, and then in the afternoon with the Russians and Ukrainians. Next is a quote from the New York Times. This was a vivid example of Trump's belief that the State Department and the National Security Council, two institutions that have coordinated negotiations on global crises for almost 80 years, are better left aside. And that's why the duo of Witkoff and Kushner found themselves at the center of recent efforts to resolve the nuclear crisis in Iran, which has lasted for more than 2 decades, and Russia's war against Ukraine, which is about to enter its 5th year. Apparently, Trump is confident in their approach, as evidenced by last year's negotiations that resulted in a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the return of all Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Countries like Russia, Turkey, and the Arab states of the Persian Gulf welcome the arrival of these two leaders, whose approach to deals is based on real estate negotiations in New York, especially considering the greater flexibility offered by Witkoff and Kushner. They speak the language of negotiators and don't spend much time lecturing about human rights or building democracy. And often their counterparts in diplomatic matters are closely connected to business deals made by the Trump and Witkoff families. Well, there you have it. Sources from the New York Times claim that Russian officials appreciated the warmth and enthusiasm of Stephen Witkoff regarding negotiations, although they sometimes doubted his reliability as a mediator. But he was clearly a newcomer to the issues dividing Washington and Moscow, and at first did not involve other American experts in the negotiations, confidently believing that he could handle it himself. According to sources, recently the Russians have been pleased with Kushner's involvement, as he takes a more organized and structured approach. But at the same time, as the New York Times writes, during their interactions with Witkoff and Kushner, the Russians and Iranians realized one thing. With these negotiators, they could drag out the talks indefinitely. Here is the quote. At the Munich Security Conference, which took place this past weekend, several participants in the negotiations on Ukraine have repeatedly stated that Russia has every reason to take part in the talks. And there are few compelling reasons to actually sign the agreement. President Vladimir Putin believes he is winning. Military officials and intelligence representatives from several Western countries have stated in recent days. And Putin is convinced that even if it takes 18 months to 2 years to gain full control over the Donbas region, every day of fighting and every night of Russian missile and drone strikes hitting energy infrastructure and residential buildings in Ukraine gives him more and more leverage. For Iranians, prolonging the process is the regime's last strategy for survival. United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio made the following statement about Iran, quote, "It won't be easy. Making real deals with Iran has always been very difficult. Because we are dealing with radical Shiite clerics who make decisions based on theological, not geopolitical considerations." But that's where the similarities between the United States negotiations with Iran and Russia end. Why is that? In the case of Iran, Donald Trump backs up his diplomacy with the threat of a real military strike if there is no progress. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, Trump, on the contrary, eased military pressure by stopping direct arms supplies to Ukraine, which had been carried out during Joe Biden's years in office. On the other hand, Trump tightened the crisis by increasing control over the Russian shadow fleet engaged in oil sales, which worsened Putin's economic problems. But on the other hand, the Trump administration is putting forward ideas about American investments in Russia if a deal can be announced. Therefore, analysts even admit that Vladimir Putin may still be able to make a peace deal to end the fighting in Ukraine, if he manages to achieve a far-reaching rapprochement with the United States and the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the rest of Donbas. But Putin is also stalling here, while Trump once again blames Ukraine and its president, claiming that Ukraine still hasn't realized that Russia is a larger and nuclear-armed power. So it's better to surrender, and here I'll add a couple more points. As part of the negotiations, Volodymyr Zelensky gave an interview to Axios, where he said that Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner told him that Russia really wants to end the war, and that he should coordinate with his team. It is based on this idea, that is, they tell Zelensky, yes, believe it already, Putin really wants peace, Putin wants to end the war. So based on this, continue the negotiations. Zelensky in response advised Witkoff and Kushner not to try to force him to sell a vision of peace that the Ukrainian people would perceive as poor. Zelensky also said that it's unfair that Trump continues to publicly call on Ukraine and not Russia to make concessions for the sake of peace. After all, it was the unwashed Russians who attacked Ukraine, not the other way around. Zelensky countered that, although it may certainly be much easier for Trump to put pressure on Ukraine than on Russia, the path to long-term peace lies in putting pressure on Putin and not letting him win. And let me remind you, in the past few days, Trump has already said twice that Zelensky should make concessions. Zelensky hopes that this is just Trump's negotiation tactic and not what he actually believes. But what's most strange is that, according to Zelensky, Washington still hasn't decided on its position regarding which country will have sovereignty over the so-called free economic zone in Donbas if it is established. Nevertheless, Trump continues to push this idea in negotiations, even though it makes absolutely no sense. At the end of this episode, I want to make a recommendation for the male audience of my channel. Many have already breathed a sigh of relief after February 14th, but March 8th is still ahead, so get ready. Often we men approach surprising or giving a gift to a woman as if we're solving a political or business goal. We fill our heads with objectives, budgets, logistics, KPIs, and so on. So we expect some wild excitement from a woman. But when she just says a simple thank you, we start to get nervous thinking, I put in so much effort, where's the excitement? And so I watched a video by a psychologist where she explains exactly why our efforts actually make things worse, and she also explains how to do it better. So if you don't want to spend March 8th working hard again with no results, be sure to check out this analysis. As someone who cares about making sure my efforts always get a real response and not just a polite nod, I found this analysis super helpful. As usual, I'm leaving the link to the video in the description and in the pinned comment. I recommend you go and watch it, just 10 minutes of your time, and as they say, the day is saved. By the way, the female audience will also find it interesting to watch. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, and subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link is in the description. Like the video and hit the bell if you want to support the work of this channel. All the links are also in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.